All right, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the open door policy today, and what that is and what role that plays in American imperialism. Really, the motivation for the open door policy was because the United States wanted two things from China. We wanted access to their resources, things like silk, things like agricultural products, things like minerals, stuff like that. And we wanted access to the markets of China. What do I mean by markets? We wanted to be able to sell stuff there. Again, there's lots of people in China. You can sell lots of stuff in China. The problem was the Europeans also wanted those same things, and the Europeans had started playing this game long before we did. Keep in mind also the reason the Europeans were able to do so was because China, which had been a pretty powerful country, was also kind of like in a period of decline. The Qing dynasty, which had been the dynasty ruling in China, had started to decay back in the 1700s. That had continued through the 1800s, and the Europeans, in fact, propped it up because they knew they could take advantage of it. And right around at this time, too, you had the arrival of Chinese nationalism under the leadership of people like Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. And so during the late 1800s, early 1900s is when the open door policy is being exercised and coming into its own, as we're trying to go ahead and grant and guarantee ourselves access to China's resources and markets. What the Europeans had done is when the Qing dynasty had started to weaken, they had carved up China into what were called spheres of influence, an area where a country would have special privileges, where one of them in particular, like legal privileges, things something called extraterritoriality, where if Britain had a sphere of influence, then a British person, let's say in Hong Kong, that was the British sphere of influence, would go ahead over there, he'd get in trouble, commit a crime. Rather than being tried in the Chinese court system, they would go back to Great Britain, where they were treated much differently and had a lot less of a chance to go ahead and get in trouble for doing something wrong in China. And that was kind of the special privileges. Also, in a sphere of influence, a country might have special trading privileges, which we'll get to in just a little bit. Several countries had these spheres of influence. England had Hong Kong, as I've already just mentioned. France had French Indochina, which included modern-day countries of Cambodia, Laos, and a little country called Vietnam. Japan and Russia would end up fighting a war over a sphere of influence in Manchuria, which is the northeasternmost province in China today. Portugal had a sphere of influence around a city called Canton. Germany and Italy had small spheres of influence. And notice one country that's missing from this list, the United States. We didn't have a sphere of influence, and that worried us. We were worried we'd be cut out from China. These other countries would go ahead and move in and would keep us from trading there. Enter the Secretary of State, John Hay. John Hay goes ahead and says that, look, we want to go ahead and make sure that everybody has equal access to China. We want to make sure China has an open door for everybody, thus the name the open door policy. And what the open door policy basically said was that countries could not prevent other nations from trading within that country's sphere of influence. And countries would do that in a couple of different ways. One, they would have special privileges like the extraterritoriality, so special legal privileges. But the other way they would do that is countries might go ahead and have special privileges in regards to economic situations, economic conditions. A country, let's say around England, around Hong Kong, would charge other countries higher tariffs, higher harbor fees, higher railroad fees for trading in Hong Kong. And that meant that England had an advantage in Hong Kong. And so they were able to trade there, and other countries weren't as able to trade there. And so we said, look, you can't do those things. You can't have special privileges. You can't have higher tariffs. You can't have harbor fees. You can't have railroad fees. Everybody should be allowed to trade just the same. And so that China should be left open for everybody. Initially, when we make this proposal, the idea was, again, to make sure that the United States had trading rights in China. The Europeans basically ignored it. We had no power to enforce it. And the Europeans were like, oh, look, the United States is trying to play the international game. How nice, how cute. They're the new kids on the block. And they basically go about their business. But it lays the foundation for the beginnings of what will become free trade, which today we have things like GATT, Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. So really, the open door policy has had a long-lasting effect. So what changed? Why did the Europeans start to go ahead and take notice? Well, what changed was the Boxer Rebellion. Turns out the Chinese didn't like all the foreigners in China. China thinks of itself till this day as a very proud, a very strong nation, and it is. It's a very large nation, and it's always been the big kid on the block. China dominates Asia throughout most of its history, and the Chinese still saw themselves that way. Wait a minute, we're the superpower here. These Europeans shouldn't be pushing us around, and a lot of Chinese were upset about it. And they formed these secret societies called the Boxers. The secret societies also go by the White Lotus Society. My favorite name for these secret societies, the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And they revolt against foreign influence. They start burning foreign businesses. They start tracking down foreigners and killing them in the street. And the European countries realize, oh, this is really bad. We need to do something to stop this. And so the European countries do something unusual. They realize China's a really big country. They can't probably do it by themselves. They cooperate. They put together a multinational force, and this puts down the rebellion. At this point, the United States participates in that and realizes we're at a critical juncture. The Europeans, at this point, probably would have liked to have carved China up into separate colonies and to go ahead and basically make their spheres of influence into colonial possessions. But the United States steps in and says, I remember that open door policy. And the Europeans go along with it because they realize if they're going to go ahead and carve it up into different possessions, that's going to mean potentially a greater war, greater conflict, greater expense. They weren't willing to do that. Plus, they were all just kind of on the same team. And so they weren't really quite ready to go to war with one another over this stuff. So they go, okay, well, this open door policy seems like a good idea. We'll at least embrace it a little bit. And we kind of get our foot in the door, so to speak, there. And indirectly, the United States saves China. Again, we don't do this out of the goodness of our heart. We don't do this because we love the Chinese. We do this because it's in our best interest. And thus you have the open door. What you have here, then, is a quick little quiz. If you want to pause the video now, and you can ask yourself some questions, see how much you remember from what we just talked about. And if you need to, go back and look it over again. Thanks a lot. Bye.